I'm Andrew Hill, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I'm the lead guy here. So I preach and help to establish and move forward a compelling vision for this church. And a part of it is providing a safe space for all of our children and actually not just for children, because what you're going to find is, as you know, Jimmy does more than just children. He's going to walk through our property with us and help us to see how to make an even safer environment for everyone that's here. So Jimmy is from the Somerset Church of Christ, that's back in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. His family, my family, went to camp together. Just Marshall. Yeah, it's just Marshall. Melissa.
And Cindy.
And Cindy. Hi, Cindy. Welcome.
Hi. Good morning. Thank you.
And so his family's from where my family grew up, and our families actually went to camp together when we were kids at the local area-wide Pennsylvania Christian camp up in Blue Knob State Park. So we've known of each other for a very long time. And I'll tell you very briefly his story, and then he'll tell you in more detail. His father and my father were actually ministers and probably spent some time together at some point because they both went to camp together, and my dad was the director of that camp. But our fathers both had different kinds of fallings out. And his father happened to be a sexual predator and groomed his whole congregation, groomed his family, and groomed the community, and made videos and everything you can imagine. And one of his victims came to Jimmy and said, "Hey, your father did this." And Jimmy went, "What?" And basically, he and his mom went down to the police and said, "Our father, my husband, is a predator. And you need to arrest him and turn him in." And then that opened up, come on in, that opened up the vast, numerous amounts of people. As you saw with Larry Nassar, there was over 100 and, what was it, 50, 120?
156 that gave testimony.
Gave testimony. And as Jimmy will tell you, there's probably another 150 out there that didn't come and give a testimony. And so his father had a large number, and probably another large number that we will never know. And so our hope is to, one, help you guys get inside the heads of these folks. And so Grace is...
Godly response to abuse in the Christian environment.
Yeah, and this is a great environment. I mean, this is a
What was
great
that again?
godly response to abuse in the Christian environment.
Okay.
And so he'll talk more about that in that organization a little bit. But he's a husband and a dad, and here's his family. And he has kids that are basically the same age as mine. His wife is very much like mine. And so we've just had a wonderful time reminiscing about our lives and our ministry. And he is a preacher, pastor, leading a church there in Somerset. And is just a kind, great guy. We've talked quite a few times on the phone and for the last 2 years, I think. And so I just want to pray over Jimmy as we begin and pray over all of us. If you would. God, we ask for your blessing on this day. We ask for your power and your presence to be with us. We ask that you would heal the brokenness that we have individually, and we ask for your overwhelming guidance as we understand the minds of those who seek to harm others and cause even more brokenness. God, you are the healer, and you are the provider, and you long for shalom and peace and blessing for all. So God, we ask that you would provide that today as we learn and as we grow and as we understand. And then we ask that you would help us to give that to others by protecting the children and by protecting ourselves and by reporting what needs reported. God, in all things, may you receive the glory and the honor and the praise. It's through Jesus that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Andrew, for really putting a plug in to have me come out. As Andrew mentioned, back in 2011, I reported my own father, and I'll share a little bit more of that story in a little bit. But God has placed me in a very unique position right now. I am strangely the only minister in the United States right now who specializes in the field of child sexual abuse. I'm also the only researcher in the field of pedophilia who's lived under the same roof as a pedophile. I maintain contact with my father since he's in prison. He's serving a life sentence. He will die in prison. And so I've maintained contact with him and have literally hundreds of letters from him where I am just obsessed with getting inside of his head, and really getting inside of our own heads and figuring out how did we miss this. I am a full-time minister, as Andrew mentioned, at the Somerset Church of Christ. I'm an independent contractor. I'm one of 6 independent contractors with Grace, which is Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Boz Chicheman, a good friend of mine, is the founder of Grace. You may recognize that last name. It's a little bit of a different last name, but they are related to Billy Graham. So Boz's mom is Billy Graham's daughter. Great guy, super great guy, good Christian man. He started off as a prosecuting attorney and just wore out from seeing people from the faith community come out in large numbers and support the predators in his courtrooms while the victim would sit there alone. As you saw with the Nassar case this last week, victims are most often left alone. They're deserted. They're told that they're making it up, they're lying, they're fabricating it, they're misunderstood. And so he got fed up with it some 18 years ago, and he founded Grace, and has been doing it ever since. And of course, my other full-time job, being a husband and father to 3 wonderful children. There are certain moments that freeze time for us. All of you, I think, are old enough to remember September 11th, right? September 11th froze time for us. I remember exactly where I was. I remember what I was doing, and I remember the plethora of emotions that came with 9/11. I was in Dallas, Texas. I was in between college and seminary. I took 1 year off and I drove coast to coast, because I say that's what every Bible major should do. That is a good preparation for ministry. So I was in Dallas, Texas, and over the CB radio, as I was coming into Dallas, I kept hearing truck drivers talk about these planes that were hitting the towers in New York City. And there was debate: was it an accident, or was it a terroristic threat? So when plane number 2 hit, that got people's attention. I was listening, I was still driving, whenever the 3rd plane hit down in Washington, D.C. And then I backed my truck into the loading dock, and I was sitting there listening to the radio. And they talked about this plane that went down in a field in Pennsylvania. And they didn't know exactly where it was, but they said we could see it from the Freedoms Airport. It's just a little tiny private airport. Well, Freedoms Airport you could see from the house that I grew up in. I'm from a little town you might recognize the name, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. A town of 240 people. Flight 93, United 93, went down literally exactly 1.1 miles from the house where I grew up at. I've spent time on ground zero, literally where the nose went into the ground. I've spent time on that spot. It's crazy how things freeze time. There was another event that froze time, and some of you may not even be aware of it because it was in the shadow of 9/11. Is anybody familiar with American Airlines Flight 587? I wasn't either. 587 is a very famous crash because it happened exactly 2 months and 1 day after September 11th. It was a plane that took off from JFK in New York City. It was in the air for 107 seconds, and we thought it was a bomb because the plane just blew up, and it landed in the heart of Queens, New York. Killed all 260 people on board, and it killed 5 people on the ground. It's the 2nd deadliest aviation crash in the United States of America. We don't remember that because, well, it happened shortly after 9/11. But I can guarantee you the people of New York City remember Flight 587. It's a fascinating crash for me, and I say that with a heavy heart. I'm not making light of this crash, but it's fascinating from a research perspective because Flight 587 changed aviation history. They went back and the NTSB started investigating it, and what they found out was that it was a combination of errors that brought that plane down. But at 9:11 in the morning, on November 12th, Japanese Airline 47, Boeing 747 Jumbo, took off. They were cleared for takeoff. And the FAA has a certain amount of space that you have to give when you have a heavy aircraft that's just under 1 million pounds take off because of wake turbulence. So because of the design of the plane, the weight of the plane, it creates these vortices at the end of the wings, and when planes fly into that, it can literally flip a plane upside down. So they have training, and they're trained what to do whenever they get into the wake turbulence. And so Flight 587, they had 5 miles distance. They were cleared for takeoff at 9:14, well within the range of the regulations for the FAA. They took off at 9:14, 107 seconds into the flight. They got into this extreme wake turbulence. First Officer Sten Mullen did exactly what he was trained to do. When he got into the wake turbulence, he asked the pilot, he asked the captain for full throttle, and he began to give a set of rudder inputs. He gave 5 full rudder inputs to the left and to the right. On the 5th rudder input, in a matter of 6.5 seconds, it sheared the vertical stabilizer off the plane, and it went into a flat spin. The G-force was so strong that it removed both engines from the plane, and the plane crashed right in the heart of Queens, New York. The NTSB went back and they started investigating, and they realized that it was a flaw error with regulations that we have in the United States. So they had made some adjustments where it made the rudders hypersensitive at high speeds. Well, Sten Mullen didn't know that. He wasn't trained that way. He was just trained that when you get into wake turbulence, you give it rudder inputs. What's fascinating about the NTSB is when there's a plane crash, they will find out what brought that plane down, and they will correct it. Period. I have some statistics on flight travel, and it's just interesting to me how safe it is to fly. In 2016, there were 16,054,495 flights by the FAA. Over 16 million flights. 3.6 billion passengers took to the skies worldwide. There's 1 accident per 5 million flights. Most of those accidents are little bump-ins at the airport. You've got a massive, like Jumbo 747, and they clip the wings. You hear about that on the news, right? They clip wings with other planes. Most of these accidents are minor accidents at the airport. There's 1 death per 10,769,230 people in 2016. Or worldwide, 2016, there were 271 deaths from crashes in air. Statistically, if you visualize our U.S. population of 323 million, if you could geographically place 323 million people all in one place, if you could look out into that crowd, you'd be able to pick 30 people out of that crowd. Statistically, you would find 30 people who would be dead from crashes. 30 people out of 323 million people. Those are your odds of dying in a plane crash. Right now, currently, there's an estimated 43 million living, breathing survivors just of child sexual abuse alone in the United States of America. Wrap your mind around that. You know, imagine if our training was like that of the FAA. Imagine if we took seriously training people and training them right. Giving them the proper training. If when there were mistakes like what happened with Larry Nassar, the U.S. Olympian doctor, if we went back and we investigated like the NTSB does, and they made corrective measures so that it never happens again, we'd have far, 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 far less instances of abuse. I'm going to tell you about another moment that stopped time for me, and you know, Andrew mentioned it already, but the date was July 29th, 2011. It was a Friday. I remember the weather. I remember a whole lot about that day. That was the day I got a phone call from somebody who said, I need to come up and talk to you. Can you meet with me? I could tell by her voice that something was dramatically wrong. And so I scheduled an appointment. She came up to my office at the church building. She walked in and she was trembling, and she held a piece of paper in her hand, and she handed it to me. She sat down across from my desk in my office at the church building. She placed her head in her arms and she began to weep. I started to read what amounted to an email correspondence between her and another adult female, where they chronicled a time when they were both sexually abused by my father, the former minister at the Somerset Church of Christ, where they were sexually abused by him years ago. My world, literally in a matter of seconds, changed forever. See, my dad was my mentor. He was a great dad by all definitions. I went into ministry because of him. I'm number 6 of 11 kids, so I'm the middle child. I always tell people I'm the messed up one. There are 5 older, 5 younger, so I got beat up from both sides. But I went into ministry because of his example, and in a matter of seconds, my life was completely flipped upside down. I could still hear her sobs as I was reading that letter. I can hear it just like it was yesterday. And I placed that paper down, and I just felt so sick to the stomach. And I told her to look me in the eyes, and I said, I believe you. She just started sobbing again, and I said, I can make one promise to you. And I said, I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know if my wife and I are going to lose our home. I don't know if I'm going to lose my job. I had just been hired as their minister, not even 2 years before. I was like a year and a half into ministry. Brand new at that church. I said, I don't know if I'm going to lose my job. I don't know if my family's going to lose our reputation. I don't know if we're going to lose our home that we just bought. I don't know any of that. But there's one thing that I do know. It stops now. I said, I will do whatever it takes, however it takes. I will stop that man from ever harming another kid again. That was at 3:30 in the afternoon. She left my office at 4 o'clock. My wife got home from work at 4:30. I literally had 30 minutes to process. My wife came home and she looked at me. She said, you look terrible. I said, yeah, there's a reason, honey. Take a seat. So I began to describe to her what I had just found out. At 5 o'clock, I had a wedding rehearsal planned for one of our church members. I said, honey, I gotta go. I left, went and did the wedding rehearsal for a very bubbly girl in our congregation who was just super excited to get married, and everything with her, everything's just wonderful. And so I came in and she's hugging me and she said, you know, how was your day? And I'm dying inside. So I faked my way through her wedding rehearsal. The next day, I did the wedding. After the wedding, we went to the dinner. We're sitting at round tables just like these. We had our assigned seats. To my left was my wife. To my right was the victim who disclosed to me. And across the table was my father. He didn't know. Only the 3 of us knew. On Sunday, the next day, I got up, and guess what ministers have to do? I preached. To a church where in my gut I knew there were victims, current victims, sitting in the audience. Also in the audience that day was none other than my father. Monday morning, my mom and I were in the Borough Police Station filing a police report against my father. Later on, the investigating officer would call me up. She would say, Jimmy, your dad just left the barracks. She said, and it's far worse than you can imagine. She said, he confessed to many, many victims. And she said, and I just need to brace you because you need to be there for your family. She said, what he did to those little girls, she said, in all the years that I've been investigating crimes, your dad is one of the worst, if not the worst abuser that's ever walked into this police station. My heart just sank. I literally think it was maybe within 10 minutes after she hung up the phone with me, the detective, who I was good friends with before. I did the wedding for both of her nephews. So I know the family really well. That's why I chose her as the investigator to go to. Maybe 10 minutes after Mom and I reported, she called me to say that he had confessed, my phone rings. Anybody want to take a wild stab who it was?
Yeah.
Bingo. My heart just sank. And he didn't know that I had reported him, and so I played dumb, and he just said, I have something that I need to get off my chest. And so I went over and I talked to him, and he and Mom at the time were separated for something completely unrelated, but after 36 years of marriage, they had separated just a few moments before, or a few months before. Very ironically, what led my wife and I to Somerset, we were down in Arkansas. What led us to Somerset in 2007, a few years prior to that, was when Mom and Dad were going through trouble, we felt sorry for my dad. And so we moved up to Somerset to basically be a support for him. Had we not moved up there in 2007, I don't think any of this would have unfolded. He would still be abusing kids. God has a very strange way of placing us in the right time, at the right place, in the right moment, with the right people. Always keep your eyes open to that. My wife and I, after my dad had talked to me, he just basically rambled on. He never really confessed to anything. He just kept saying it over and over. I'm screwed. I'm going to go to prison the rest of my life. What I did in this stupid country, he said, you know, people look at it like it's really bad, but if this were anywhere else in the world, what I did was, it was just minor and it wasn't that big of a deal. And he was just rambling. Just rambling. So I ended up leaving there, and my wife and I just got hit with this big burden. How do we tell the church now? A few days after I met with my dad, he met with me again prior to being arrested. And he said, just as an aside, oh, by the way, so that you know what you're dealing with, let me tell you who my victims are. He started naming, just as I'm talking to you now, just casually, just started spouting them off. Several of those very young children in our church. When I went home, I told my wife, I said, this family that's here at church, he abused every single one of their little girls. And we just broke on a level that I can't begin to describe to you. I started thinking, where's the manual for this? Where's the training? When we went to seminary, I spent 4 years in college and 4 years in seminary. Where's the training? We didn't spend 1 minute talking about child sexual abuse or any kind of abuse. We would want to hear from our minister of the congregation before the police knock on the door to say, every one of your daughters has been sexually molested. I had the misfortune of the abuser being my own father. So we went as the minister's family, and as friends, and unfortunately the abuser was my father. I tell people I have over 1 million miles under my belt. I've driven truck on and off for, I don't know, 12 plus years. I have a lot of miles under my belt, over 1 million. The longest mile that I ever drove was from our house to that family's house to tell them, my dad raped every one of your little daughters. Then we had to figure out, how do we tell the church? How do you tell the church? When do you tell the church? Who do you tell? At the time, we didn't have any leadership. There was no leadership structure. I was in. We had no elders, no deacons at the time. How do you tell the people that the man you loved for all these years, who ministered at this church for 27 years, raped multiple children, and some of those children within this church. We coordinated with the detective. He was arrested on a Friday. She called me and she said, "Your dad's been arrested. This is the weekend to tell your church. It's going to be in the paper on Monday." We informed the church. My wife and I drafted a letter, which I read before the church. And we drafted a letter that said, "Under no circumstances should you ever support this man. These are not just allegations. There's an open investigation. We can't give you a lot of information, but we can tell you that the allegations are true." We had to begin a healing process, not just for ourselves, to try to figure out, where's God? I had to figure out all over again, who's God? Where's God? Where does God fit into all of this? Why does God allow innocent suffering? Why did God allow this to happen? For 40 plus years, my dad sexually offended children. From the time he was 14 till he was 61. We had to wade through all that stuff. So as we're healing as a family, we're trying to wrap our minds around the hurt and the pain for all of his victims, but we're also trying to lead a church through this. And at the same time, we're trying to divvy up. My mom and I divvied up siblings. And which one of us is going to call which siblings? We said, well, these people will respond better to you, Mom, and these people will respond better to me. And so we're literally trying to figure out, there is no manual for this. I was very, haunted is not the right word. I became obsessed, unhealthily obsessed, with how a family full of people and a whole community, how for decades, he was able to successfully molest dozens of victims, possibly hundreds, and none of us saw it. So I started buying every single book in the field of pedophilia. I grabbed every top researcher in the nation, and I just began consuming it. I mean consuming it. My wife came home one day, and I will never forget it. I was sitting Indian style on our living room floor with a mountain of books, and I was just sitting there sobbing when she came home from work one day. She said, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" She said, you're hurting our marriage, you're hurting our family, you're hurting yourself." And I just looked up at her, and through the tears I said, "Because I have to. I have to know. I have to know, how did we miss it? How did he do it?" And so I began a journey of research where I maintained contact, still maintain contact to this day with my father. I actually have in that backpack over there a letter that he wrote me from prison about a week and a half ago that I haven't even opened yet. Maybe that'll be my lunch exercise today. It still takes me that long just to get up the courage to open these letters. I have hundreds of them. So God has placed me in a unique position because I was not abused by him. I adored him, I loved him, I respected him, and I have over 30 years of hindsight where I can go back in time and I can think about and I can compare. When he writes me letters and he starts recounting things, I can go back and I can say, okay, which parts is he bullcrapping me and which parts is he telling the truth? I can actually analyze letters and I can go through them and I can pick the wheat from the chaff, and it's this bizarre, really bizarre psychological process. But in doing that, what I found out was that in order to get inside of the predator's head, you've got to understand them and you've got to be intimate with them and you've got to know them really well. You also have to have access to other people in your close circle. I happen to know many of his victims because he victimized people at our church. I know many of his victims and have a very good relationship with them, and so they've given me information. I have different siblings who have given me letters, and so he'll write me a letter and talk about how wonderful prison is, and he doesn't have to pay health care, and his cellmates have his back, and they protect him and they cherish him, and he's the old head on the block. He'll write me that letter, And then the same day I'll get a phone call from a family member who's sobbing saying, do you know how bad Dad has it in prison? Literally one day I said, what's the date on the top right-hand corner of that letter? As my brother's calling me and sobbing saying, do you know that people are threatening to rape him? Do you know that he's getting beat up all the time? Do you know that the COs are calling out that he's a child molester? I said, let's compare notes. I was holding in my hand a letter that he had written the exact same day that was polar opposite of the letter that he sent my brother. I have access to that research. And so I've been able to get inside of his mind without him knowing that I have access to all of this. I've been able to write and talk to and interview hundreds of people. There's never been research that's been done on that level. So that's where Buzz one day at Grace, I'd just been blogging. At that point, it was several years ago, I was just blogging, hammering my thoughts out. He contacted me one day and he said, can we talk? He said, I've been reading your articles, and he said, your level of expertise is unprecedented. Which floored me, because for me it was just, kind of trying to figure things out and put that into writing. So that's how I wound up with Grace. And so what I do is I train people, not the generic red flag behavior. My training is very different from other training. Teaching red flag behavior does not work. I don't mean to be offensive, but it doesn't work. And here's why. Red flag behaviors are very generic. Red flag behaviors talk about behavior. Pedophiles, what they do is very little behavioral, and it's, for them, everything is about skill set development. I actually reject the term grooming, even though it's what it is. I understand, I get it, but what they're doing is not grooming behavior. What they're doing is testing people. Constantly testing people. Everything they do, every word that comes out of their mouth, everything they do, they're testing people. And so I liken it to a magician. Because it's very much, what they're doing is very much like a magician. And actually a lot of them are using the same skills that magicians are using to keep us blind. How many people watched the Larry Nassar, some of the victim testimonies? Okay. The recurring theme that you heard over and over and over and over again was what? Our parents were where?
Right there.
In the room. And Larry Nassar is not the exception to the rule. He is the rule. This is what pedophiles do. I've talked to literally hundreds of survivors as I travel across the United States. I'd say that nearly 90 to 95% of them have told me we were abused over and over and over again in front of other adults. And so what they're wrestling with is, from the child's perspective, why didn't the adults, didn't you hear that this last week? Why didn't the adults step in and do anything? Why didn't my parents do something? They were in the room with me. Here's why. Because they didn't see it. And so I'm going to teach you guys today, and especially tomorrow during the walkthrough, I'm going to show you the techniques that these guys do to abuse people literally in front of us. And in order to do that, you need to know two things. One is how predators think, and the other is how we think. See, we don't train people that. We teach them these generic red flag behaviors. Now imagine with a magician if we say this. I'm going to give you some red flag behaviors about this magician. He's going to get up on stage. He's going to be wearing all black. He's going to have a pretty assistant who's wearing all red. She's going to serve as a distraction. He's going to use cheesy humor. It's all going to be scripted. He's going to walk down into the audience. He's going to hand select somebody from the audience. He's going to bring them up on stage. He's going to use different language patterns. And he's going to pull off these amazing tricks. This is essentially the training that we're giving people. I've told you absolutely nothing about how that magician did his tricks. So what I do is I say, it's about perspective. We have the camera pointed in the wrong direction. We have the camera, we're looking through our eyes, and we're looking out, and we're trying to find these guys, and it's like, I mean, honestly, anybody that's in this field knows it's literally like picking a needle out of a haystack. They'll say, pedophiles, they're so manipulative and they're so good at blending in that we can't find them. Even top experts in the field, Dr. Anna Salter, one of the leading experts in the world, she says, I'm not comfortable saying that I'd be able to pick a pedophile out of the crowd. She lives it and breathes it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take people up on stage with the magician and spin the camera around, and instead of us looking for them, I want us to look for us. Does that make sense? We need to understand something about ourselves and see ourselves the way that pedophiles see us, through their eyes, from their perspective. At the same time, I want to teach you guys some of the skills that they use, much like a magician. When they do tricks, I'll show you step by step how they're doing their tricks. I'm going to unlock the magician's code. I'm going to show you how they use their tricks and what techniques they're using so that in real time, you can be the magician sitting in the audience, so when the magician's on the stage, you're not being wowed. You're able to see. A magician sitting in the crowd is not wowed by the magician on the stage. Why? Because he knows the techniques he's using. So when you do that, when you shift that perspective, these guys stick out like a sore thumb, and I'm telling you it works. And Andrew and I actually have somebody who I don't know personally, Andrew does. I put this man in prison from this tool that I'm going to show you guys right now. I've never met the man in my life. The man was abusing victims for over 40 years. Nobody had a clue. Nobody had a clue. I presented this. I just call it my fruits tool, and you'll see why. I'm going to do that for the next 2 hours, this session and the next. I presented this at 2 different churches and got a phone call about 6 months apart from each other from both churches saying, this guy pegs on all 20 of these. And I said, well, okay, that raises awareness, but you can't report that, right? Because the threshold is reasonable suspicion. If you're actually going to report something, and my goal is to put people away. The threshold for reporting is reasonable suspicion. So I said to both of them, I said, we have to have a smoking gun. One minister said, I think I know who to call. He said, I've seen these boys with these patterns of just self-destruction. And all of them have spent tons of alone time with this man. He contacted one of the young men, and right away he just called him up. He said, hey, I'm just calling to check on you. What I'm about to say, there's no unawkward way to say it. As soon as he said that, the boy said, it's about so-and-so, isn't it? He said, I was 12 years old whenever he started to abuse me. He went to the police, state police reported it, the victim did. After he reported it, more victims started coming forward. They started reporting, as you saw with the Nassar case. Victims become empowered when people believe them. When people believe them. That's all it takes, people to believe them. The man is now behind bars, where he belongs, and we're hoping that he spends the rest of his life there. He has a lot of victims. I'm going to show this just because no matter how much I say, no matter how much I talk about it, we still have this perception that abusers couldn't be my best friend. Couldn't be my dad. Couldn't be my uncle. Couldn't be my doctor. The man's what do we hear most often? The man's a pillar of what? Pillar of the community. Couldn't be. I show this picture to show my dad was not some weirdo who was in the corner petting little baby dolls and, you know, hanging out with kids and not adults. My dad was a minister. He was doing a wedding for my best friend and his wife as I was reading scripture. That same month, there's me doing a wedding for my sister and her husband and my dad reading a scripture because I asked him. There's my family, my siblings, my mom. There's my dad, one big happy family. None of us had a clue. So I'm telling you, if you're thinking, well, we're going to look for the creepy guy that's, off in the corner, it just doesn't work that way. And I'll talk more about that later. So this tool, I'll talk about how I developed this in this session. The next hour, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this. Okay, so I'll give the background to this session. We'll talk about the nuts and bolts of it the next session. First, we're going to talk about persistence. Merriam-Webster defines persistence as continuing to do something or to try to do something even though it is difficult or other people want you to stop. Another definition, continuing beyond the usual, expected, and normal time, not stopping or going away. And I said this, perpetrators are persistent in every aspect of their lives. People who live with them find themselves continually worn down, exhausted, and most often they don't know why. My mom separated from my dad because after 36 years, she was just worn out. She couldn't put her finger on it. She couldn't figure out why, and she felt bad, by the way. He was the preacher who everybody loved. He was the dad who all the kids adored. He was the guy who never cussed, never raised his voice, never. But she was worn out, and she didn't know why. And persistence is what allows perpetrators to continue to gain access to hundreds of victims. Because of their persistence, they do not, will not, and cannot stop. They simply shift their focus to new victims. How many times was Larry Nassar turned in?
150.
Yeah, eventually. But over the years, right, there were multiple children who came forward. Rachel Denhollander, how many times did she report him? Persistently reported him. Other victims, all the way back to 1997, victims reported him oftentimes multiple times, over and over and over. Kyle Stevens, the first young woman to give a testimony, she told her parents, when she was 12 years old, he had sexually assaulted her when she was 6, all the way up until she was 12. She told her parents didn't believe her. They called Larry Nassar to their home. They were family friends. They called Larry Nassar to the home, sat down and asked him, did you do these things? So convincing was he, right? So convincing was he that the parents had Kyle apologize to Larry for making up all these bad things about him. In 2016, when Larry Nassar got arrested, Kyle Stevens' father, after years of just family wedges, and it created all kinds of family problems because Kyle, she just suffered with that her parents would not believe her. In 2016, when Larry Nassar was arrested, so riddled with guilt was Kyle Stevens' father that he took his own life. The persistence. They do not, will not, cannot back down. This is a constant with 100% of pedophiles. This does not change. They simply focus they shift their focus to new victims, and it's precisely because of persistence that this tool works. Perpetrators hide many things, but their persistence gives us these definitive actions that the people closest to the perpetrators can identify and monitor. Unlike many assessment tools out there, it can't be cheated. You can't come in and be like, okay, Jimmy has these 20 areas, we'll just come up with different ones. These are the foundational elements that magicians use. Does anybody watch Penn and Teller? Penn and Teller Fool Us? Come on, yeah, there got to be more nerds than me. All right. So about a quarter of us have nothing better to do with our time. Isn't it cool? Like, it's just a cool show. Penn and Teller talk about magic, and they say all magicians use 10 foundational principles, and from that they come up with tons of different magic tricks. But in the end, there are 10 foundational principles that these guys all use, all of them. This is the same with pedophiles. These are the 20 foundational things that all pedophiles use. And so I want to show you guys this and how this thing works. And then I want to couple that with talking about the actual skills. So this is some of the behavioral stuff to look for. Then I want to get into the nuts and bolts later this afternoon and talk about skills. The actual skills that these guys are doing based on this foundation. So the word persistence appears on each description of the fruits as a continual reminder that persistent behavior is always a constant. This is always 100% of the time present with grooming type predators, which is about 90% of your pedophiles. 10% are your grabbers, the ones that open up the car door and grab the kids. 90% are your groomers. They're the family friend, the person who's respected, the person who's loved and liked. And then I'm going to talk about intuition, and this works two ways. One is that the predator has incredible intuition, off the charts intuition. Predators can walk into a room and within seconds they can know who their victims are going to be, and they can feel with the adults who the vulnerable adults are who are matched to that child. They feel it intuitively. Intuition is not enough for them. That's why they begin this series of testing. And all the research that's out there, they say, well, they're going to pick the kid that's living in the trailer park somewhere that he's been raised by Uncle Bob and Uncle Jim Bob, and we paint this picture where it's like the most vulnerable of vulnerable kids. Not necessarily true. There are people who target very wealthy families. Kids who have very good parents. Lauren Book is a case in point. Lauren Book has an organization called Lauren's Kids. She's a senator in the state of Florida, very young. She's, I think, in her upper 20s. Her dad is a very prominent attorney. She was sexually abused for years by a female pedophile. Had a great home. So what they do is they'll intuitively find a vulnerable kid, which isn't that hard to do because children are just malleable. All kids are malleable to a certain extent. But then they intuitively know which parent is going to be vulnerable and somewhat naive. But that's not enough, and then they begin a series of benign testing. Before they ever abuse a kid, they begin a series of benign testing. And they test and test and test, so they have to match the right kid with the right adult. And why do you think that is?
If they don't get caught.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Dr. Gene Abel estimates that for every single time that a child molester produces a hands-on victim, every time he has an instance of abuse, he has less than a 3% chance of ever getting caught. And to put this in perspective, for over 40 years, my dad operated at 100% success rate. Never were we tipped off. Never were we thinking, well, gee, I wonder if he's molesting kids. He literally operated at a 100% success rate. So I come back and I say, either pedophiles are the luckiest people on the face of the planet. And they need to go out and they should really be, I'm being quite literal, they should scarf up every single lottery ticket that's out there because their luck is just that good. Or they're incredibly skilled at what they do and they don't get caught for the same exact reasons why magicians don't get caught. They practice, 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 practice before they ever take the stage. So intuition works that way, but intuition works the other way where we have intuition. Our intuition was kicked up at different times. Every single person who I talked to who interacted with my dad at any point in history has times where intuition was kicked up. We don't know what it was, but it was that gut feeling. Something doesn't feel right. Gavin de Becker has a book, I actually quote him here. Gavin de Becker has a book, one of the best books I've ever read, called The Gift of Fear. If you have not read it, get this book. The Gift of Fear. Here's what he says. What Robert Thompson and many others want to dismiss as a coincidence or a gut feeling is in fact a cognitive process, faster than we recognize and far different from the familiar step-by-step thinking we rely on so willingly. We think conscious thought is somehow better, when in fact intuition is soaring flight compared to the prodding of logic. Nature's greatest accomplishment, the human brain, is never more efficient or invested when its host is at risk. Then intuition is catapulted to another level entirely, a height at which it can accurately be called graceful, even miraculous. Intuition is the journey from A to Z without stopping at any other letter along the way. It is knowing without knowing why. This is a God-given gift that every single one of us have. Jude says about wolves who masquerade as sheep. These people blaspheme all that they do not understand, and they are destroyed by all that they, like unreasoning animals, understand instinctively. Instinctively. Intuition. Let me spend about 5 minutes setting this up here. This was my journey. Me and Jesus had words. Jesus says in Matthew 7, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Now listen what Jesus doesn't say. You shall have sympathy on them because you are the church who should be grace-centered, and you should coddle these wolves and restore them back to health. Right? Jesus does not say that about wolves. Why? Because wolves are not sheep. They never were. See, we have trouble. Our theology is so messed up and so troubled that we have we feel guilty making a distinction between wolves and sheep. Oh, well, that's being judgmental. You know, it's interesting. Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 says, "Should we not judge those from within?" Judging is wrong. We shouldn't judge. Wrong answer. There's a problem with that. It's not biblical. We shouldn't judge those on the outside, but those on the inside, Paul says, you better be judging, and you better do it right. And you better use fair and balanced scales. So Jesus says this, beware of them. You will recognize them by their fruits. Anybody want to guess why I had a problem? Let me go back in time and think about every single time that I know that my dad was gaining access to victims for the purpose of sexually offending them. And I went back and I started writing it down. I was writing it down. I came up with dozens of them that I could think of. Talking to victims of his and saying, okay, when did he do this? Where were we when he was doing this? What did that look like? I came back and I got more frustrated than I was ever before, because what happened was when my dad was producing fruits, not only were we not being tipped off and weirded out and the hair standing up and our intuition being kicked up, the exact opposite was happening. Every single time that my dad gained access to victims for the purpose of sexually offending them, the exact opposite took place. He was getting pats on the back. He was literally having parents come up and say, when are you going to babysit my kid? So I'm sitting on this for a couple of weeks, and I'm just cursing at Jesus. Not literally, but I was mad. I was like, this just rolls off your tongue, Jesus, like it's, yep, you're recognized by your fruits. I bolted awake in bed one night. I sat up, and I had this aha, come to Jesus moment. And I was like, I get it. The fruits that they produce, the reason that they mix in with the rest of us so well is because they're producing fruits that look exactly, precisely like the fruits that you and I produce.
They want to blend, right?
That's right. So the fruit on the outside looks absolutely fantastic, marvelous. So we see the outer side of the fruit, and we're like, my goodness, this man he's a godsend. And it's not until we cut the fruit open and dissect it and look at what's inside that we realize it is rotten to its core. So we've not been given the tools to do that because our theology doesn't allow for it. We don't know what's in people's hearts. Baloney. We know exactly what's in people's hearts. And I'll show you that, too, after the break. See, our theology it's watered down and sanitized to the point where we can't look at people and we can't profile people. We're scared of that word. We can't profile people and use our God-given intuition because we feel guilty and somehow that's judging people, and I have my own log in my own eye. And then we come up with all sorts of colorful ways to represent that. Well, a sin is a sin is a sin. that's not biblical. There are all kinds of degrees to sin. Jesus speaks to it. Jesus, in 1 minute, he's hugging a woman, well, not hugging, but he's standing between a woman and her accuser who's been caught in the act of adultery. Other times, he's flipping tables over and premeditated, right? Twisting together whips made out of cords. And then he uses all kinds of fancy language in the New Testament, like, it would be better if anybody who caused one of my little ones to be offended had not just a millstone, and for anybody who's taken Greek, the literal word is donkey millstone. It's a millstone that's so big it can't be moved with human people. It's too big. You literally had to hook a donkey to this thing because it was massive. Think of the visualization of that. It's a millstone that's so big that when that thing drops over the side of the boat, because that depth isn't good enough, he says it would be better for them if they had a donkey millstone tied around their neck. Well, when that thing goes overboard, what happens to the neck? It snaps or gets cut off. This is a very graphic, intentionally graphic description. And that person be drowned where? Not in the bathtub, in the depth of the sea. See, it wasn't enough for Jesus to have the person's neck snapped off. Jesus says, and be drowned in the depth of the sea. And that would be better for that person. A sin is a sin is a sin. It doesn't work. It didn't work in the Old Testament. It doesn't work in the New Testament. There are different degrees because there are different motives. And motives are everything. The thief on the cross is a prime example. We have two thieves, two very different responses. Motive is everything. So, as we walk through this, I'll show you guys what these fruits are and just raise some awareness. So then we're going to couple that later on with some actual techniques. When you combine the two, it's a very powerful thing. You guys will never see people in the same light. There are going to be people who are sticking out like sore thumbs. But there's going to be substance behind it. People ask me all the time, they're like, well, one of the most asked questions I get, how do you keep from being paranoid? And I'm not paranoid. Our children are very normal. They have friends. They go out and do things with friends. Paranoia is so counterproductive. So counterproductive. Can you imagine? If we were walking around, we're like, oh, I wonder if he's that way. I wonder if he's that way. I wonder if she's that way. Can you imagine? Be pure chaos for us and pure bliss for the real pedophiles. They would love it. They love when people are paranoid. So yeah, paranoia is counterproductive. So I want to give you guys tangible things where you can see things in real time, real techniques in real time, and say, no, George, you're not taking Mrs. Smith's kid home with you, and here's why. I just witnessed you in the last 5 minutes. You did this, 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 and this. And not only Mrs. Smith, I'm going to let everybody know this man doesn't need to have your kids in his home. So I want to give you guys tangible things, and that's what we'll do in the next hour. All right, let's break for maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene.